We also have a lot of information to share with you as President Trump is, or as President-elect Trump, rather, is making known many of the people that he hopes will round out his cabinet in the coming days. Matt Gaetz selected as the Attorney General. One of the things that the former president has said is that he will end the partisan weaponization of the justice system. You see him there on your screen. You also see former Representative Tulsi Gabbard of Hawaii. She's notable in part because she ran for the Democratic nomination for the president in 2020. Obviously, she did not secure that nomination, losing to Biden. She endorsed the former president in this last election. She has been nominated to be the Director of National Intelligence. Also, you saw just a moment ago, Senator Marco Rubio of Florida. Despite the two leaders sparring out on the campaign trail when the former president was running initially for the presidency, as was Senator Rubio, he has now been selected as Secretary of State for the new Trump administration. Obviously, all of those positions will, of course, have to be confirmed by the Senate. This comes in addition to a controversial choice that is getting a lot of attention right now for Defense Secretary. That's Fox News host and veteran Pete Hegseth. Many people wondering about this selection in particular, but of course we have seen that the former president is very intent on building out his cabinet with people who have said that they are loyal to him and his administration's objectives in the next 100 days. We have heard a lot of information from the transition team about how they intend to conduct this transition. And we heard also from the former president that he had a good day with President Biden as well. Now, let's talk a little bit about some of these selections as we are waiting for some of the members of our Washington, D.C. team to join us. But we're hearing that Gaetz, as his selection for the position of Attorney General, was coming not as a tremendous surprise, in part because he has been so loyal. He has been such a part of the MAGA movement there in Washington, D.C. In his position in the House Judiciary Committee, he has railed against the weaponization of the Department of Justice and what they have called politically motivated investigations and criminal proceedings. One of the things that we also heard from the former president, and I'll quote from his Truth Social post, was that, quote, Matt played a key role in defeating Russia hoax and exposing alarming and systemic government corruption and weaponization. He is a champion for the Constitution and the rule of law. However, Gaetz is also under investigation by the Ethics Committee for some of his actions. So his appointment, not without a couple of questions as well, because there are allegations of sexual misconduct and drug use that he has denied. However, that is going to be part of a question in the days ahead as we will hear nomination proceedings and confirmation proceedings taking place in the House. There's a lot of stuff that has happened in Washington, D.C. over the last few hours, not the least of which is the selection of Marco Rubio as Secretary of State. He has long topped the short list, and we now have CBS News political reporter Olivia Rinaldi. Olivia, you have been following. You've been following all of these developments for us. So talk to us about any surprises that you've heard. Olivia, do we have you?
Could you repeat? Sorry, we're getting all set up here in West Palm Beach.
All right. Olivia Rinaldi is traveling with the president-elect. So, Olivia, I've updated our viewers on the selection of Matt Gaetz for Attorney General, Marco Rubio as Secretary of State, Tulsi Gabbard as the Director of National Intelligence, all of that following the news earlier that Pete Hegseth would be nominated as the Defense Secretary when the president-elect does take power. Talk to us about how significant any of these developments are, what you are hearing from your sources in the Trump transition team.
Well, these are huge developments that we're just hearing about now, especially the news of Matt Gaetz came as a little bit of a shock. I was just talking with sources not too long ago about who could serve as Attorney General, or who Trump could pick, rather, to be the nominee for that role. And then all of a sudden we see Matt Gaetz' name. He's not a name that was being thrown out or one that we had been tracking. We had heard Senator Mike Lee as a potential. We had also heard several acting attorney generals, the one from Missouri. Also, Whitaker was someone who was being mentioned as well. So all these names percolating, and then Matt Gaetz pops up. We know he's someone who is deeply distrusting of the judicial system, of the DOJ, of the FBI, of leadership there. So it was notable that Trump is picking him. And of an advisor I spoke with earlier about all of these picks, including Pete Hegseth for Secretary of Defense, question being of exactly these people who are a little bit outside of Washington or skeptical of leadership in Washington and why they would be picked. They told me that this is part of Trump's mandate. This is part of the reason why he's picking some of these folks, is they don't want the traditional leadership that we've seen in Washington in the last several years. They want people who are going to disrupt this system. That's exactly what this Matt Gaetz pick is really signaling to Washington, signaling to people Trump is putting into power, as he wants to disrupt what is currently in place. And it's also notable, I heard the guests before talking about, issues around ethics surrounding Matt Gaetz. He's the congressman from Florida, but he has been embroiled in controversies on Capitol Hill involving ethics investigations. I actually just had a source text me a little bit ago when we found out about this news, who said that they were very, very surprised to hear that, a Republican source on Capitol Hill, that they would be tapping Matt Gaetz. So we're all trying to work through exactly what this means, the impact of this going forward for Trump's administration, but also important to note that these are all nominees at this moment. They still have to go through Senate confirmation, which can be a very rigorous process. So we're all watching this very closely, of these people that Trump is appointing to these positions.
We are watching a lot of things all at the same moment. I have several screens, and it looks like in that West Palm Beach shot that we just saw, the president-elect deplane there in West Palm Beach, Florida. We also have a response from Matt Gaetz. He wrote, "It will be an honor to serve as President Trump's Attorney General." Certainly, we know that the two men have been close in the past, that they have seen eye to eye on many things. But you were talking a little bit about the controversies surrounding Gaetz. I'm hoping you can give our viewers a little bit more of that discussion.
Well, there have been a lot of investigations surrounding Matt Gaetz and his conduct relating to things outside of Congress, issues surrounding women that he's been investigated with. It's been a very long, ongoing process. But what's also important to note that this is part of the reason why Kevin McCarthy is no longer Speaker of the House. As you know, Matt Gaetz was one of the people who kind of led that crusade to oust him as Speaker of the House, and now he is outside of Congress in California. Still part of Trump's orbit, talks to him very openly and pretty frequently. But as far as Matt Gaetz, we do know that he is still under those ethics investigations. So this raises a lot of questions about exactly why he was the pick, why Donald Trump chose him, and who could be serving underneath him as Deputy Attorney General or undersecretaries in that sector as well.
So given that controversy, given some of the concerns that we've heard expressed about Pete Hegseth as a selection for Defense Secretary, is it possible that either of those nominations or any others might be rejected by the Senate?
It is possible. Of course, they still have to go through that process of what the nominee will have to do, which is sit in front of Congress, in front of the Senate, and face tough questioning about what they would do in that role. I was struck yesterday by one of my colleagues, Christina Carrujo, was up on Capitol Hill and asked senators about their reaction to the pick of Pete Hegseth. And a lot of Republicans said, "Oh, wow," or "I would have to look into that." that's interesting. That's subliminal messaging you can kind of see on Capitol Hill. If it's not a just resounding, I trust him and I expect him to do a good job, that they want to look into it, tells me that there might be a process here where these people are facing that tough questioning. Whether or not they'd be ultimately approved by the Senate is ultimately the question here. Trump's putting forth the slate of his cabinet. People like Senator Marco Rubio, who we know has been a long-time senator from Florida, might not have as much difficulty being put into the position of Secretary of State as someone like Matt Gaetz or Pete Hegseth would, as people want to see what really their credentials are, what's really on their agenda, what's their priorities. We know Trump is picking these people because they will enact his priorities and his agenda. But as far as what that would actually mean for the American people, these senators, I'm sure, will grill them and ask them those questions.
And Olivia, we did just see the president-elect deplane. We also saw many staff members leave with him as well. We understand that the Trump transition team is working very quickly. They're trying to announce all of these nominations. What positions, if you could bring us back up to speed, are still some of the ones that are most questionable, that people are waiting to hear who might get those appointments?
Well, there's still a few that are waiting. We know that Trump has put forth his DHS, his DOD, his Secretary of State, all folks of that sort handling immigration, things that he sees as top priorities. So you can kind of see with the slate of people he's putting forth already what his focus is going to be. But there's still some outstanding people as well. That includes Secretary of Treasury, who Trump would pick for his Economic Council of Advisors. As we know, inflation is still a huge issue in this country. So we're still waiting to hear picks on that, but also Energy Secretary, Veterans Affairs, we're waiting to hear on. So a lot still outstanding here. We expect in the coming weeks we're going to learn more about that and perhaps a few more surprise picks, given that the last 24 hours we've seen a lot of surprising picks, people and names that we had not heard of. And I will tell you, just from trying to speak with sources and get inside scoops of what's going on at Mar-a-Lago, someone told me yesterday it's like an iron dome. We're not going to hear very much. They're keeping it very tight-lipped, very close to the chest, even as evidenced by the pick of Attorney General and Secretary of Defense. So all very interesting there that Trump and his team are not very willing to talk about it with the press, not really willing to show their cards and who they're thinking of. And I expect we'll get more of these surprise announcements either on True Social or in press releases as well.
Right, Olivia Rinaldi, thank you. Senator Marco Rubio is talking to reporters following the official announcement of his selection to be Donald Trump's Secretary of State. Let's listen.
I've known him for a long time. And again, I think the president is entitled to his team, and he's made his appointments. And I like Matt a lot. I know him very well, and I'm confident that if the Senate confirms him, he would do a good job. And again, presidents are entitled to have the people that they want in these key positions to carry out the mandate that's been delivered to him by the voters of the United States.
Do you think Gaetz
there was a tweet today? There was a tweet today saying that does Italy is a democracy, or does an elected official take the decision? This tweet was from of the unelected official take the decision, referring this to the judiciary, the Italian judiciary system that block an immigration law. This tweet was from Elon Musk. So,
I can't comment. I haven't seen that. I don't know what he's referring to. And while I know the importance of our alliance with Italy and how important they've been, I most certainly wouldn't say I'm in a position right now to be an expert on the judicial system. So you'll have to ask whoever it is that posted that.
Do you think Gaetz can be confirmed?
Again, I think most of my colleagues understand that presidents deserve great deference in appointing people to key positions in government to serve in their cabinet, and that's how I expect they'll continue. But obviously, I'm not sure if I'll even be here for that vote. So, okay, thank you.
I
think that's a good pick too.
All right, very interesting. In the first conversation that we were hearing, at least, with Marco Rubio, the Florida senator, after learning that the president-elect was going to be tapping him to become the next Secretary of State in the Trump administration, most of the questions were actually about the selection of one of his colleagues, Matt Gaetz, to be Attorney General. On that, he said that presidents are entitled to their appointments. We want to go back now to CBS News political reporter Olivia Rinaldi. She continues to follow this. She was listening alongside us. So, Olivia, I think that's really indicative of some of the challenges that that Representative Gaetz is likely going to face in his nomination to the position of Attorney General, when almost all the questions for another person who was nominated today was all about Gaetz. You were in the middle of talking to us a bit about some of the challenges that Gaetz has ahead of him, as well as the role that he has played in the Trump orbit.
Yeah, so he's continued to be a longtime advisor of the former president. Even after Trump left office in 2021, Matt Gaetz was still someone who courted Trump and had conversations with him. We do have a little bit more detail to share with you about some of those ethics investigations facing Matt Gaetz, including in the legal troubles facing him, even as he's nominated to be the top lawyer in the country. In June, the House Ethics Committee released a statement confirming that Gaetz is under current investigation for a long range of things. Bear with me. They include sexual misconduct and financial impropriety. And a source on the committee said that he is still under investigation, talking to our Michael Kaplan. Also, in February 2023, last year, the Department of Justice, which Matt Gaetz would be leading if he is confirmed, said that they had dropped what was a sex trafficking probe of Gaetz. And we had reported on that extensively. We first reported on it in 2021, where the DOJ had been looking into sex trafficking laws if they were violated on a trip that Matt Gaetz took to the Bahamas, illegally trafficking across state lines people there to the Bahamas. So a lot that he is still under investigation for. The DOJ, as I mentioned, dropped those charges. But as far as the House ethics investigation, that is still ongoing. So still a lot of questions about this individual serving as the top lawyer for the Department of Justice.
And we should note that Gaetz has denied the allegations against him. And we're also watching for our viewers, just to continue bringing you up to date. That is the president-elect's motorcade as he travels back from Washington, D.C. after meeting with President Biden at the White House to his residence in West Palm Beach, Florida.